we are different to like a networking sort of community. We are a community of people who support each other through learning about so many creative and diverse skills or practices of every practitioner within our community. And it's all about connecting, supporting and challenging each other. So we thrive off people. The more you give to ASP, the more you'll get out of it. And it's down to thanks to people like Jane today, who's going to share her knowledge and like inspire us all that ASP runs off. And yeah, we just support each other, and it is a great community. And I will leave a link in the chat box to ASP's website for you to all look at the end. And we're luckily here today with Jane Shaw, who I'm really excited. I've been in contact with Jane for about a year now, and so I'm really excited to have this event today. She's an ethical marketer and environmental communicator, and has been working with sustainable businesses for over 20 years. So we are all very lucky to listen to Jane today. And I just wanted to check that everyone's happy with recording. If you're not, if you just put a thumbs down or something, just but it'd be good if we can get recording for those who can't make it today, because yeah, hopefully the message can go out wider than just us tonight then. And before we start, we'd like to do a minute silence. If we're trying to I'll put a link towards it at the end, but invite some more mindfulness activities. And I think it really grounds us at the start of a meeting to, not a meeting, I know it's not a meeting, but an event, to really focus and feeling very present in this moment. So if I'll start the minute now. Thank you all for sharing that moment. So I'd now like to pass on to Jane, who will now lead the rest of this. But a bit of housekeeping as well, sorry, before we start. If you have any questions during the event that you think that will be relevant in that moment, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and Jane will address them as they come through if they're relevant to what she's saying and you want to spark a conversation. If not, leave your questions to the end and then pop them in the chat box at the end, and we'll have a Q&A and more of a conversation towards the end anyway. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I mean, just to back up what Hannah was just really saying there about ASP. We were in the last ASP event we had. We were speaking about ways of doing things, and Jan, who's here today, mentioned about this idea of starting meetings and conversations with this 1 minute, and we were like, be crazy. Could we do that online? Would it work online? Don't know, maybe. And we're just like, let's just go for it. Let's try it. And that's, I think, what's really lovely about ASP is it just becomes this really a space where you just feel like you're being inspired, and a space where you can experiment and try things. And yeah, it's a lovely community. So anyone that is interested, I would wholeheartedly recommend it. And I don't have to say that, unlike Hannah. So yeah, in terms of what we're here for today, degrowth, post-growth, something else. I think probably most of us in this room have got a rough idea of what we talk about, what we mean when we talk about degrowth or post-growth. And essentially, it is this idea of living within planetary boundaries, living without overconsumption, living in ways where we have enough, but not too much. And I think, there are so many phrases out there that we use. We talk about degrowth, we talk about post-growth, but we also hear people talking about steady state economics or well-being economies. Regrowth is one that's coming up more and more as an option, as an alternative to degrowth at the moment. And even, when you start looking at things like donor economics, we're generally talking about the same basic principle. It looks slightly different in different ways, and some people tell you, oh no, degrowth, it's a route, that's the transition period until we achieve post-growth. But actually these phrases aren't defined. There's a lot of fluidity. We're still at that stage where it kind of means what people want it to mean, and different people still have different definitions, although we all have this broad framework of it means we're living within our planetary boundaries. I think this idea, though, that we need to radically change the way we do economics and the way we do society is really where it comes down to. And for me, it's the important thing about all of this is that I care about how we make transition happen. I think, like a lot of people in this room, it seems obvious to me that this is the only way forward, that we can only go on if we start living differently. And that's not just about climate change and biodiversity loss. That's about how we function as communities and societies and individuals. But in terms of how we get there, in a way, we're not thinking about that enough, and we're running really short on time. So when we talk about it, even, I think even for those that maybe don't know degrowth, it still feels to us in this kind of space, the kind of people that are in the ASP space, the kind of people that care about sustainability and regeneration, it's the kind of idea that excites us. I know for me, like I'd been immersed in like overconsumption and living with less and simple living for years before I actually heard about degrowth. And it was just incredible. It was like, oh my gosh, this thing's out there and it exists. And it was amazing. It was fantastic. And it just it was really life-changing to realize that people were already there. And what I was thinking about, I wasn't alone. But I think the issue is how almost those of us that are here already, that get it already, that want to see change, that want a better way of doing things and think this is it, how do we, in essence, as the pioneers, as the change makers, how do we work with others to help them see what we see? How do we get them to agree with us if we assume that what we're saying is what we should be saying? And I think to illustrate, this importance of getting it right and understanding where others may be at. A really good example for me was a few years ago. I got asked to work with a company that make reusable nappies, reusable diapers. And at that time in the UK, there were about 5% of parents in the UK using reusables. And all the messaging that was coming out about them was all the same. They're good for the planet and they're good for your pocket. And so whether it was the businesses, whether it was local councils, this message was going out again, because again and again, when you ask these parents that were using them, why did you choose to use them? They would always tell you these same two things. It mattered to me to save money. It mattered to me because of the environment. But of course, it was, when you think about it, it was the wrong question to the wrong people. What we needed to do was ask the 95%, why aren't you using them? And at that point, we suddenly started getting all kinds of questions, all kinds of replies about, well, my mum says it's really time consuming. Oh, well, you've got to soak them. Or you can't use them in childcare. And as soon as we started understanding those issues, because we in that world didn't understand that other people had those issues, we were able to address them. Now, we didn't do it alone by changing the messaging. David Attenborough and Blue Planet kind of helped a little bit. But actually, we're now at the stage where just 5-6 years later, it's around 30 to 35% of families use reusables to some extent or another. We did that by stopping looking to ourselves and looking out. And this at the moment is where we're at with degrowth. We can all sit here and have these conversations about degrowth, and we can see it as exciting, as a possibility, as better. What's not to love about the things that we see that degrowth is going to bring? Often when we hear about degrowth, we hear people talking about things like a universal basic income. Yeah, you're going to have higher taxes, but it's going to be really good services. And a lot of this, of course, for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us in the sustainability space, these are ideas that appeal to us naturally, because most of us think things like equality, equity, social justice are good things. We like those things, and we can see how degrowth achieves those things as well as a habitable planet. But if we turn that round and we start to think about someone who believes in low taxes, someone who thinks that light touch government is the way forward, someone who thinks that we should trust markets and let them do their thing, then actually, when you're talking about those things, you're not just talking about beliefs, you're talking about identity. And just in the same way that beliefs about, for instance, social justice are absolutely core to my identity and how I see myself, those ideas about low tax and markets, they are important and are part of someone else's identity. So when we talk about growth and low growth, actually, we're fundamentally attacking that identity. And, you know, we talk about security nets, and that's just alien. It's just different. One of the reasons that's really important at this point in time is because we are living in a polarised, divided world, hey, in case you hadn't noticed, and it's been spotted. This contradiction's been spotted. Last year, for those in the UK, we had a kind of an interesting experience in the UK with basically a prime minister who lasted for less time than she had a shorter shelf life than a lettuce, essentially. And one of the more kind of bonkers mad moments was when she gave this speech. And in her speech, she created a bogeyman, because let's face it, we've got to have a good old bogeyman, or a bogeyman comprised of a coalition, and it included Labour and the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, the three other biggest parties. And it included anti-Brexiteers and environmentalists. And the name she gave them was the Anti-Growth Coalition. Now, at the time, it was ridiculed because this coalition didn't exist. There was no such thing. She made it up. It seems laughable to imagine that this coalition that's basically about 80% of the population is somehow the reason that she's been thwarted. But it wasn't laughable. It wasn't funny, because that name really matters. We know where her inspiration was coming from. We know who was influencing her. And it's Tufton Street, it's Kosh, it's Heritage Foundation. It's all of these people that have made a lot of money from oil and gas, who believe in the markets, libertarians. And that might sound conspiratorial. Basically, what I'm saying is, by putting Anti-Growth Coalition out there, a seed was planted that anti-growth is bad. It's not part of our identity on the right. And the reason, it might sound a little bit conspiratorial, but if you look at what's happened in the UK recently with low traffic areas, it's this idea around 15-minute cities where, again, basically, I think most of you all know what that is, this idea that you have everything you need within 15 minutes of walking or cycling of your home. And somehow that's been politicized. Somehow it's been made an identity issue, that this is about them trying to control us. And again, it's been made divisive, it's made political, it's been made conservatives against progressives, right versus left, woke via the neo-libs. And we're on the cusp of that happening around growth, degrowth, post-growth. With that in mind, within sustainability, within degrowth circles, there is a lot of discussion about this word, in particular degrowth. It's the main way it's described. And there is discussion, and truthfully, some of that discussion's been quite unpleasant, dismissive sometimes. It's certainly highly charged. You get people arguing things like degrowth is a missile word. That means that it's something that we shoot in there, and we need to scare people. That's the argument. Honestly, it's wrong. Another argument we hear is, it doesn't matter if people don't understand what it means. If people think it means recession, it doesn't matter. It means we're starting a conversation. That too, frankly, is wrong. And the reason I say those two things with certainty is because from a communications perspective, it's clear. The irony here is that the very people who say we must listen to the scientists, we must listen to the experts, aren't listening to the scientists, listening to the experts on this. Because if you talk to behavioural scientists, cognitive psychologists, communications experts, even people involved in change management in business, they will tell you that this isn't how we achieve change. This isn't what happens, that we need, their message is clear, that we need positivity, we need hope, we need trust. If we're to make change happen, we don't scare people into change, and we need to make it positive. So the consensus among the communicators, the psychologists, the change makers, is that degrowth in particular, it's a really terrible word. To give an idea of that, many of you might know George Lakoff, who communications expert, author of Don't Think of an Elephant. Of course, what happens when we're told not to think of an elephant? We think of an elephant. And that's what we're doing with degrowth. Don't think about growth. But you said degrowth. I'm thinking about growth. And it's just an interesting, idea about where do we then go from here? How do we move forward if we know that? From my point of view, I don't have an answer. I don't have a magic way of describing this. I do know that the closest I've seen is post-materialism. It's an interesting one because there was a study done in the US, which of course is probably more along that end of the spectrum than certainly in Europe in terms of, your left-right divide, but also your further right wing. But this word, materialism, actually got the same response from all ends of the spectrum, political spectrum. The right don't like materialism any more than the left. Conservatives don't like it, progressives don't like it. Anti-materialism unites us because no matter where we come from on the political divide, for whatever reason, we do all see materialism as negative. And we see damage, and we don't like what is done to society. Not just us as individuals, not just our kids, but we see it in societal terms. We don't like what materialism has done to society. So maybe there's something there. Maybe that's how we move forward from here. Maybe anti-materialism can unite us in a way that attitudes to growth never do. But I don't know, because maybe that's still too negative. Maybe that's, we're still looking to the past. We're still looking at what we want to get rid of rather than what we want to achieve. And so maybe we do instead need to look at, in terms about what we want to embrace, how we embrace what's on offer. Maybe, this is an opportunity, to galvanize ourselves, not in terms of framing it in terms of what we've lost, but thinking about what we're going to gain. And of course, the other thing I think we need to consider in this conversation about how we move forward is never mind not thinking about an elephant. Maybe we've got to address an elephant in the room, which could be, is it too late to change? Has degrowth as a word already become embedded in our language, in our rhetoric, in our discourse, in our minds, in our literature? And so I think the conversation that I would kind of like to look at opening up from here is, how do we imagine a world where everyone can prosper? No matter whether they're in the global south, the global north, no matter whether it's nature. How do we all flourish? How do we all prosper? And no matter what that means to us as an individual. And as we talk about the future, how can we do that in a way that does not divide us? How do we do it in a way that excites us? And how do we do it in a way that makes us all want to change? And I think for me, as I say, I'm pragmatic about this. I want to see change happen. Quite frankly, I don't care where it comes from, because my kids are 15, 12 and 6. And I want them to be able to sit here and have conversations like this when they are 45 years old. So that for me would be what I would ask of all of you. So far, we have had many, many failures when it comes to communication. And if we all walk out of here tonight with a better understanding of how can we communicate, how can we understand others in a way that gives us all a fighting chance of survival, I'd be really, really happy. So thank you. I can see already in the chat, we have Sam has pointed to enoughism, no anti. And I think, I think that's a really useful starting point for where we move forward. So if we can open that up, that would be fantastic. Ines.
Hi, Jane. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely perfectly, yeah.
Sorry, I rushed back from a very busy day, but I just wanted to catch this because I very much agree that degrowth is a very problematic word, even though I'm a complete degrowther, but I never ever use that word. In fact, my organization is called Growing Good Lives, because that's what I think we all want. We all want good lives, but the different ways that we attempt to get them have different impacts on the world. So I use the human scale development framework which starts from 9 fundamental needs that we all have. And it's a way for us all to think of ourselves as having these same needs, but just having making different types of attempts to satisfy them. And I've been running these workshops for a decade, and I've worked with very wealthy people who will actually say, you know what, the economy is, if I look at it through my needs, and some of those needs are needs for affection, needs for participation, needs for identity, and they go, actually, if I look at it through these needs, the economy isn't working for me. But we tend to not ask that question. We're obsessed with talking about parts per million or GDP. And if we start talking about needs, it creates a wonderful level playing field. So I worry about this obsession with keeping these words as out of principle and just thinking, oh, people are ignorant if they don't get it. It's like, you know, like I'm like you, I'm a pragmatist. However we have to tell the story, we have to tell the story so that people get it. So that's just my bit, and I'm just really grateful that this is a conversation that we're having right now.
From my point of view, absolutely. And I'm really sorry, but I've just got to fangirl because I'm absolutely so delighted to see you here, Ines, because Ines and I have only ever seen each other on LinkedIn. And actually, I'm going to confess that I was actually saying to Gwyn last week, we really need to have that conversation. And it's an absolute delight to have you. And thank you so much for joining us, because I know you can add so much to this conversation that we all really, really need to hear. So thank you. Does anyone else? I'm looking in the chat, but does anyone else want to?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there, Jane. Ines, I think, in a sense, you sort of summarised a lot of my thoughts that Jane was provoking. In that, I think she gave lots of examples of how we have the wrong conversations. We talk about the wrong characteristics of the outcome that we want. And what you offered there, Ines, was this idea of having a completely different conversation. So the 15-minute sitting was too simplistic a concept or a communication. And it allowed people's fears on both sides to grow because there wasn't the positives articulated and accentuated for all enough. And I think that's been a really good lesson to us. I'm sitting here in Wales at the moment, and last month I sat in at the Black Mountains College climate careers talk, and the climate environmental minister, and Hannah, you may correct me here, for Wales, Julie James, spoke for about 20 minutes. And what she was describing was a completely new economy that's based on the fundamental industries that are needed to create a good community that will thrive, that will then be focused, and the whole Welsh government's approach then will be based on providing the education to support the jobs that will be needed in that industry. And it was almost impossible to disagree with it, because it was only saying that everyone will thrive in this situation. We'll have different economies that we focus on. Wales has just closed the last open cast mine in Merthyr Tydfil yesterday. And the population were so pleased that this coal mine has been closed, because they can move from that historic economy to the future economy, which is going to be in Wales based on forestry and wood and timber and everything that feeds around that. And it was a beautiful conversation, because it was open to everybody to see the positives for them, rather than saying, oh, we're going to take from you and give to you. It wasn't an us and them. It was a very inclusive conversation. And I think the sort of language and communication that Ines was talking about really fits into that, of this is a conversation where everybody can see how they can thrive. The rich, the not so rich, the poor, the currently excluded. And unless it's an all-embracing conversation, it's going to have enemies. And you know, we can't do that. I think, as Sam said, no anti, only pro.
Nora, do you want to speak next? I can see your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. This is such a fascinating topic, Jane. Thank you so much for talking about this. What I'm also thinking about, having recently been a lot in the American discourse around the Inflation Reduction Act, is this research that just came out where, and I know this also from anecdotal evidence, because a friend of mine who lives in New York and is American does not know what the Inflation Reduction Act is about. And it's called Inflation Reduction Act, and at the same time, it's like world record investment in green energies and sustainability. And people don't know what it's about. And people are interested to know what it's about. And there was this great research done where they basically asked people, do you support the Inflation Reduction Act? Yes or no? And almost everyone says no, because they don't know what it is. And then they ask, do you support these and these measures to build green economy and put money and jobs and great opportunities into communities, et cetera, and clean energy? And then suddenly I think approval rates soared to 75%. So that's just to say that, yeah, it's fascinating exactly what Jane said, what communication can do, and how impactful it can be. And also, to be honest, how stunning it is that people, like, with such a big policy, people should know better, and the people who are working on communicating it should know better, but somehow they don't. So it also kind of surprises me at the same time how these things are being done and how they could be done differently.
Thank you. Isa, did you have your hand up before?
Yeah, thanks. I was still reflecting about what Nora was just saying. So, yeah, it could also be that we might have to tell many different stories to different people, because we all have very different identities and ideas about ourselves. So I heard this a very interesting, positive story about an Italian who was so outraged that there was a McDonald's being opened in some very traditional place in Italy. And he said, can't be, we need to mobilize. And then the slow food movement came out, and it was basically attracting all people who were interested in healthy ingredients and restful ways of eating. And that was their story, and it had a certain impact. I listened to another story of a woman coming from Canada and talking to people in the US about climate change. And the first question that she got from the audience was, so are you a Democrat? So, and she said, no, I'm Canadian. I guess we really need to get away from the topic that we want to achieve per se. We want to achieve a certain kind of mindset change, and we want to inform people, and we're passionate about the things that we seem to have understood. But what we know from psychology is that facts, or the knowledge of facts, have hardly ever influenced people to change their ways. So it is actually more important to create like networks or situations where people start to trust each other, and where then you can influence people's opinion because you have already bonded over another topic. And once you've created this bond and you have established, oh, we're both moms and we're struggling with the same thing, and now there's another topic which we might have a conflict about, but because we already built that bridge before, we have more of an opportunity to talk to each other because we trust, and because we like to be with each other, and we like to have a conversation if we can't come up with an agreement. So it could be that we have to tell many, many different stories, some that are about a different way of eating, some that are for slow fashion, some that are for repairing your old fridge, some that are for drive your car until it dies, some about personal well-being and healthy psychology, where your self-worth is not dependent on all the things that you're buying and accumulating over life. Some could be about work-life balance, where you're telling young people, hey, it's really cool to just work 4 days per week and take the additional day to have reflective thoughts about things that matter. Full stop.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of that resonates for me. And when we're talking about the Democrat or the Canadian, for those who haven't come across Catherine Hayhoe, I thoroughly recommend looking for her on YouTube, TED Talk.
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, because my goodness, does that woman nail it? Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think you're absolutely right. And I wonder how much of it, in that sense of finding stories and making the right stories, right people, means we've got to operate locally rather than globally. You know, I know where I am right now. I'm surrounded by trees. I'm living in a place where I'm on an island, so water is very important to us, drinking water. But we're also, it's a place of incredible natural beauty that can be preserved. But we have logging. And I think most of you know about old growth logging in British Columbia. Yeah, that's what we've got. And there's a conversation going on at the moment with a proper old school logging lad. And he's your stereotypical logger. And one woman who's got a PhD and is in her 50s and is wanders around when she's having a meeting, just sits on the floor and starts doing a yoga and takes her shoes off. Somehow she has managed to influence this stereotypical logger simply by showing him how his future can carry on, because he has to become the steward of the forest. And whereas now his job is to go in and chop it all down and make money, actually she's showing him that he can be the steward, he can be the expert who understands that these are the weak trees that threaten us with forest fires, because that's our biggest threat. If we have a forest fire, we lose 50% of our drinking water for decades. And he now understands how important he is to our community in terms of his knowledge of which trees to cut down to keep the forest healthy. And that's a complete shift in roles from the logger that used to go in with his chainsaw. But have we got time? And are we too nice? I think the other thing that struck me from what you said there as well is I do wonder if we're almost too nice. If, you know, when I talk about things like that anti-growth coalition, that was some very organized, very clever, it was some real planning. And you look at the planning that's going on in terms of what we see from PR, whether that was from tobacco, what's now being done in oil and gas. And can us being nice and disorganized and community-based, is that a positive? Is that going to be changed quick, or are we just fighting against something that's big? I don't know. But yeah, sorry, 6 different threads came off from that, but thank you. I'm looking at the chat and seeing Jan. Do we need lots and lots of community conversations where people talk about what bothers them, and finding what they have in common by listening to each other? People's assemblies. I don't know, Jan, is there anything else you want to add to that? No, I'll add to that then. I think, yeah, it is that commonality, isn't it?
I think as well, like with the topic of degrowth, like as such, like if I spoke to my housemates about degrowth, they wouldn't have a clue what I was saying. And I think like unless you're like, because we're all like passionate about sustainability and within that field, like we understand the topic a lot more. And it's trying to, and if you ever explained it to someone, they just see the negatives, because you think, well, why wouldn't I want more money, or why wouldn't I want more things? Like it's really hard to change that mindset. And I liked Jane, when you were explaining about like the nappy industry and like how you have to understand the people who aren't using them, because for me, like I did my dissertation last year on repair cafes, and I was surprised, like speaking to the people who use them, their reasons behind it, because the majority of people wasn't the environment, it wasn't the planet. Why their reason behind it was either their emotional attachment to that item, or it was the money reasons as well. And like it's just understanding that there's, for different people, there's different reasons. And I think it's unpacking that we need to sort like find out as well, like all the other factors that are within that topic that influence people's decisions as well and behaviors.
Hi. No, I just wanted to comment on what Isa, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her name, was saying
Isa,
about
like Isabel.
Isa, okay. In terms of the dialogues, you know, and communities, and I totally agree with what you said, and like, we are running out of time, we need to do something quicker, you know. But at the same time, I think there is, especially with cost of living crisis and so much pain, you know, that exists in the world at the moment, I think people are really worried about what is happening when they go to the supermarket, you know, when there are so many things, you know, that are happening with people now. And I think it's almost like we need to be in listening mode to create for these people to heal from the pain that they are going through and the challenge that they are going through, so that they can create space in their heads to change behavior, you know. So we know, you know, from reading, from studying, and from working this space, that sometimes actually the repair cafe can help them financially, you know, or that some of the circularity behaviors that we would like, buying secondhand or fixing things, etc., they are actually better for them in the long run. But I think there is so much noise, and there is so much crisis, and there's so much in people's minds at the moment, that if we don't listen and don't help to create space, we will probably be speaking to our echo chamber and not create that impact that we want to create, you know. So yeah, so I just want to bring this point about listening, really. And another point, very briefly, sorry, as I have the voice, is how to support, in a way, you know, the people that might lose in some of this transition. And I'm not speaking about the billionaires, you know, they don't need any help, to be honest, but it's people like the logger, the example that you were saying, or the people who worked in the coal mining, or people that, I don't know, in the countryside of India that don't have electricity in that place, and they actually use coal. And if they don't have coal, they cannot switch on the lights, and their kids cannot do homework in the evening, you know. So I think there are some people that they cannot see, you know, what is the new role for them, and they cannot see from A to B. So it's, how do we create that space that I was speaking before, but also how do we are inclusive in that transition. I think sometimes our echo chamber, we are victims of the middle class, upper middle class type of dialogue, you know, and actually there is a lot of people that are struggling with much more fundamental things that we want them to change some kind of behavior. And I think our dialogue and even our language is not always as inclusive to some of these people. Thank you.
Ines, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, there's a few things. I particularly like what Paula is saying about those people who are struggling at the moment. There are many people struggling. And the attitude that we sometimes have in the environmental movement and the social change movement is that we don't understand how hard it is to make change when it's already so hard just to live. And I think that we have missed a trick when we allow the, I guess, the right, those of us who want the status quo, let's call them that, we've allowed them to hijack the environmental message and make it sound as if it's an anti-human message. And we need to make sure that people understand that what's happening to the poor, and it's the same thing as happening to the earth. If the poor understood that the same mechanism that is extracting from the earth is extracting from them, they would be able to see the whole picture. But right now, they have hijacked the narrative, and we are not stepping in there and making a better case for social justice. And I think that if we don't make that, we are not going to progress. We have to now be on the side of the people, because the people, like if you think of the biodiversity of humans and the diversity of cultures, that is also being reduced. We now have this homogenous, you know, sort of like, you know, Coca-Cola, Burger King, McDonald's culture that's spread all over the world. Whereas, you know, even sort of 50, 100 years ago, we had all this diversity. And if we could change the narrative to show that to people, to say just a few generations ago, your family was probably self-sufficient. Your family had a relationship with the land. And look at where you are now. And now what we have is a culture where I always love, you know, I love my artisan bread, but I love the example of this. It costs you £4.50 to get your artisan loaf. 100 years ago, that was just staple food for people. They were able to access that. They didn't have to go through some kind of, and that is what's been taken away from the working class. And that is why they're very angry, because we can't just be sort of greening our lifestyles and then telling them, oh, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, without understanding that whole piece of culture change that they have been subjected to. And all they need to do is go back a few generations and they will have found people in their family who could take care of themselves and who had a relationship, probably that was an ecological relationship with the land. And I just feel it's the missing piece of our dialogue that I would really like us to start putting into our conversation.
Paula, you've got your hand raised. Would you like to add to that conversation?
Yes, I totally agree. And I think that there is another point, which is, I think our people who work in this field, we understand that relationship that you were talking about in terms of, you know, how inequality is related to how we work with the land and how and the consequence to biodiversity. You know, this dual crisis of natural system breakdown and inequality. But I think the status quo coalition, as you name it, they are not that worried about explaining and being right or being saying things in the right way. They are worried about having simple messages that stick, like, you know, the anti-growth coalition or etc. So it's about, I don't know, going back to the UK, like, but put a message on the bus. It's all about the NHS and everybody's going to have good health, you know, if Brexit happens. So I think we are disorganized, as Jane rightly said, because we see the complexity. It's not simple, you know, everything is interconnected, and it's not one silver bullet that is going to solve it all, you know. So we are so concerned about being precise and saying the right things and being accurate about the science, about this and that. And then comes in, you know, the status quo coalition, put a message on the bus, and then here we go, you know, and then nobody remembers what the 10 of us said in different words, you know, to explain the problem. The message on the bus is that the one that stick. So I don't know the solution and I don't have a suggestion, but I think agree with the communication problem, but I think we need to be mindful of that. How much do we need to be a little bit simpler and to engage as well, listen and be simpler? I don't know.
I think the other thing as well that we can do on that is it's not even always about going back a couple of generations. It's about looking at what we've got going on in the world now in other cultures. I mean, Laurie and I, 8 months ago, maybe 10 months ago, had the absolute privilege of walking through a rainforest with a First Nations knowledge keeper whose lands we are on. And this was, we were on a master's in environmental masters. And I honestly think that hour and a half that we walked through a forest with a knowledge keeper who could tell us what was used for this, and everything was related to his family and his background, and it was all interrelated. And he was telling us about his conversation with the deer in his garden. Why was the deer eating his vegetables? And the deer looked up in the mountain and he saw where it belonged, and he understood why the deer was coming in, because his lands had been taken. And you know, and this knowledge is still around us. And I don't know how we access that necessarily in the UK. It's much harder. But certainly in somewhere like North America, you know, and in many places, we still have this understanding, this connection with community, with everything. And it's another story. It's another story that helps us relate and understand. So I can see 2 hands up. I think, Nora, probably your hand was up first.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. I agree with everything that's being said. I want to complicate things a little bit. I'm from the German version of Sheffield, from the Ruhr area, which is where the German, well, part of the German economic miracle happened, and so coal mining and steel production and so on. And it all went to shit in the 60s when they started to outsource those jobs to other places such as Asia and so on. But I'm middle class, but where I'm coming from, the general identity of the Ruhr area is hard work and coal mining and steel productions, and there are songs about it. And when I hear them, I feel very, very moved, and I feel very heard and seen, and it's part of my identity, even though I'm a very well-educated middle-class person who has had nothing to do with coal mining and steel production and any of these things. And I think, and today, like, I don't think we have any coal mining anymore, and steel production is almost completely phased out, and like Volkswagen or Nokia took away all the jobs. So these economies don't matter anymore. And yet the coal miner or the person working in the factory is oftentimes used to make arguments against sustainability. But what about those people who still have 10 jobs in this one almost completely taken down factory somewhere? So I think, yes, we need to think about the people whose livelihoods are genuinely being taken away from them or actually endangered by greener economies. But I think, even as someone who gets all the feels when she hears about the coal miner, we need to be super careful that this is also a very tokenistic approach to a very romanticized thinking about some of the places that we come from instead of the reality. Like there are no coal mines anymore where I'm coming from, yet this argument always comes up, what about those 10 people somewhere? Like there's thousands of people working for Deliveroo. And we're not like, oh man, Deliveroo, these proud people who made our cities what they are. And currently they are what makes our cities what they are, right? So I think sometimes the way we conceptualize and think about the people who are the disadvantaged people in our society is being taken advantage of by political discourses that have nothing to do with the actual economies that we are currently living in.
Sorry, I just managed to lose myself on the screen, which was quite impressive. Issa, do you want to add something to that? Or?
Yeah, I can. I believe that there are certain parts of society that will certainly have to be supported through whatever transition phase our individual economies are going through. So there was this story that I followed where there were a couple of NGOs starting to have a dialogue with oil rig workers, and they wanted to figure out what people need, what makes it difficult to have their job, if they could envision a different kind of work, what their requirements are towards the head of the company. And they found out that actually these workers would all be in support of renewable energy and would also be happy to be retrained in order to work in the different parts of our economy. So there's always an option. And the question is how to finance this. But that's a totally different part of activism or storytelling. And that's a total different way of making formations that can have an impact towards the government. And a larger part of activism that is happening right now is that a couple of agencies that are really good at creating a massive global voice are getting together. They're finding individuals that are part of the top 1 to 8% of society and make them demand the governments, please tax us super rich so that all super rich don't have an escape hole anymore to get away from their duty to contribute to the society. And if you are able to generate higher taxes, you would actually have the resources in order to support the parts of society that would need to be retrained and that need to be supported in order to find new jobs in a new kind of economy. So yeah, there's part of storytelling to influence certain parts of people, and there's certain parts of activism and activities that need to be taken in order to influence governance. And there are certain activities that are needed in order to create first mover coalitions, even in part of those economies that are currently very difficult to move away from their typical ways of doing things. And it all needs to happen. There's just not one golden path. And whatever skills we have, we should use them in order to direct them in that field where we feel we have the biggest leverage factor. Oh.
Thank you. I think it's so important, the idea of that, different ways. It's so important. I'm going to interrupt us all slightly. I'm conscious that it is 8 o'clock. For those, we do have till 8:30 for those who want to, but obviously completely understand for those that do need to get away. Obviously in the UK it's 8 o'clock. For those of us who aren't in the UK, it's not. But yeah, for those that do need to get away, please don't feel that you need to hang on. But yeah, we are here till 8:30. We do have the time. We are here for another 30 minutes. That would be more accurate. So yeah, don't feel that there's any pressure, but I just wanted to put that in there. Sam, I'm going to put the spotlight on you, Sam, because you keep on dropping these absolute nuggets into the chat, and it is so on point every single time. So I'll be really, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, it would be fascinating to hear what you've got to say. We're going to have to unmute you first, though, Sam. Sorry, we've got you on mute at the moment.
Greetings. Thank you for having this. It's interesting. I'm an experienced environmental activist here in the United States. I've run the Raritan River Environmental Festival. I've taught in middle schools in the Citizen School program. I'm a LEED certified green builder. I've been at this for a long time. I'm very concerned about language linguistics and about our unified movement being completely outmaneuvered by very sophisticated forces against us, that we've developed an absolutely magnificent skill set at steering right into their traps on numerous things, degrowth being just one of them. There's a real interesting angle on all of this, and let me just go back to the Inflation Reduction Act, because it did come up. I just recently completed Al Gore's group, the Climate Reality Project, did a training around the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a wonderful program, but they really don't have their mechanism together. The money's been allocated, but how they're going to get it to the street has not. And that's a huge problem, because they want to roll it out through the contractors so that people don't have to get money after investing in solar for their home, replacing gas boilers and the such. But the reality here in the States is that we have a shortage of tradesmen. And getting the tradesmen to the table with that program is going to be hard, because their incentives really aren't there. They've got all the work they can handle. We need a massive program to train people in basic building trades, not the esoterics, the basic stuff, hard wiring. Anyhow, back. I see a huge opportunity around mental health and extreme weather events, and from the standpoint of climate equality and justice, there's a real opportunity for those of us of means or limited means to pay attention to our communities and the points of vulnerability. Because if you engage the populace around, what are you going to do when there's the next big heat wave? What are you going to do when there's the next hurricane or typhoon or severe weather event? Here, I live in Western New Jersey along the Delaware River. We never used to have tornadoes. We had 4 of them in the last 8 months. These things are changing, and they're obviously irrefutable. And so you have the opportunity to go forward in an apolitical fashion, which is absolutely critical to any success in this space. And I think we have to sort of shift to a way of thinking. A concept that I've been spending a lot of time working around is the concept of profound localism. You know, just going on your own block and having a coffee session about, if there's a bad storm, what do we do? What are our community assets? Who has a generator? Who would be willing to share that? Who would be interested in buying a bunch of extra power cords so that we could rig together? Who's thinking about doing solar? Would you have any interest in a concept of a microgrid? Would you like us to get somebody in and speak about that? I just see this real opportunity to reinvent the movement in a hyper-local fashion. That's my 2 cents.
Sorry, I lost myself again there. It's quite good, this. Keep on losing myself, which I kind of actually quite like, but it's not very good when you need to unmute. Thank you, Sam. I think really, really interesting. Again, going back to what we were saying earlier about stories and that relatability and what have we got in common, because is there anything that we have more in common than the street we live on? And yet so many of us don't know the people we live next door to. And I just wonder how much, again, that connection comes back into both our storytelling and our effectiveness, our connection both to community, to ourselves, to our own creativity, and also to nature. Thank you. Does anyone else have something to add into that?
No.
After you, Nora.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this was a really good point, about the hyperlocalism. One thing that I've also, outside of hyperlocalism, found super interesting is I recently read a piece by Yale Climate Communications where they basically adapted practices from the trans rights movements, how the trans rights movement engages with very, very difficult conversation partners who are really not like aligned in any ways with their values. And I think there's also something to be said about not only talking to your neighbors and getting hyper-local, but also talking with movements that are like in conversation or maybe struggling with the same problems and learning from them, even if they're not from environment or sustainability or green transition, etc.
Yeah, interestingly on that, again, I'm on an island, so you're forced to be a community, whether you like it or not. You know, interesting for me, I mean, I grew up in rural Scotland, so I grew up in community because it was 40 minutes to get anywhere. So you just didn't do it. Everything we needed was in our community, and it's the same now. You know, although we're a relatively small population, basically you don't have to go off the island because we have to be dependent. You know, we have services that we wouldn't have if we're online because we're just too far away. And it is really interesting. So last year, as a community, our local transition movement set up a climate month, but it was designed to coincide with Indigenous Rights Day. It was designed to coincide with Pride. And so all of these different organizations became very invested in environment. And of course, because we're local, it's what I said before, we can relate it to our own watershed. We can relate it to our own forests, the lands that we care about. But yeah, it was incredibly effective at starting conversations. And, you know, people kind of going, oh, I didn't realize that DESI, the local LGBTQ group, was so interested in climate. And, you know, and it was those conversations, and it was a massive success. It started so many conversations.
I just wanted to bring it back to one of the first, if you like, fears that you mentioned, Jane. You know, your children. And one thing I think that we're probably all talking around is that we don't see the change we're talking about as being catastrophic. We don't want a social or economical collapse. We want the welfare of everybody to actually be enhanced. And I think that's a large part of the confrontation is caused by people thinking they're going to lose out and they fight back. And as Sam pointed out, the Green Deal program that was put together by the UK government to improve house insulation, micro power generation was a complete and utter failure because they just couldn't organise it. They just didn't literally have enough people trained with enough finance in place to go and do what everybody wanted. Everybody in the community was interested in lower energy bills, warmer houses, and no dislocation. They wanted life to continue. And suddenly they're running on a different form of electricity. You know, we have situations in Britain now where sometimes all our energy is being generated on a daily basis by green energy. Who notices? Nobody. And that's exactly how we want the transition to go. The systems that we support us need to be changed while we're still living our lives. And I think we've got to extinguish the fear from these sort of conversations and make people clear that it's not degrowth, it's a different form of growth. Different things grow. You know, we have more teachers, we have more nurses, we have more carers, we have more people working on the land. We are still short of people to work. There's no shortage of work in this new model. It's a model that offers opportunities for everybody, but just very different ones. But the outcomes on a societal level will probably be the same. Sadly, we will still have the same number of billionaires. We will still have the same pyramid of the poorer people at the bottom. But the only way we know that an economy works is trickle up. We know it's been proven trickle down doesn't work. The only way that the modern economy is going to work is when the people at the bottom can earn enough to consume and buy the services they need to live well, and that the people that provide those services can get rich by doing so. So it's not going to look a lot different, but underneath we will have hopefully learnt to live in harmony with nature. We won't be having threatening climate change, and we will have restored the biodiversity. But it's not going. Hopefully, it's not going to affect the average person's life in the sense it will more or less go on as today, but hopefully in a more constructive and a more harmonious way than we do at the moment, because the old models we've got are running out of steam. They are actually a destructive force now, and we have to shift that away. But we don't want our children to live in poverty and to do without things that nurture them, you know, foreign travel so they can learn about the world and meet different people, and these are going to be baked into the new model, which is going to do it differently without the negative impacts that the current model is generating.
Can I respond to that, Gwyn? I'm afraid I don't share your optimism. I think that one of the problems we have is that we cannot have Western lifestyles for everyone on the planet. So Western lifestyles are going to have to come to an end. The positive thing about that is that Western lifestyles don't actually make people that happy. So we haven't grown in happiness since the 1950s or 60s. There is some figure that says something like, oh, you need sort of like £50,000 a year, and beyond that, you really do not gain much in well-being. So if we were following science, if we were truly a science-based, rational economy, we would just have a wealth cap for the sake of wealthy people. Wealth makes people really nasty. That's also proven by science. Why are we listening to science? Because basically the people who make the rules have gained from creating a certain narrative that we are now, unfortunately, looked into So we are probably all sitting here because we have a certain degree of either simple boldness or we have a certain degree of comfort. And our task, I think, is to liberate those people who do not have the freedom to come and have conversations like that because they've got 3 jobs, they're living in, you know, a moldy house and all that kind of stuff, which is in the UK now frighteningly common. And I feel like we could create these allies if we could show them that we are the better friends, because we risk losing them to the right, because the right, as someone already earlier said, has got a very attractive, simple narrative. So I really love what you said, Sam, about, you know, reaching out to communities, because that we will need each other desperately very, very soon, in the same way that things are happening all over the world. So that fear that people are going to start to feel makes them very vulnerable to the strongman narrative.
Yes.
And we kind of have to get in there before they get in there. We have to say there's a different way. We can do this collaboratively without violence. And so, yeah, I unfortunately, I think that it is going to get ugly. And it's not something we talk about a lot. But I'm quite concerned about us not taking the amount of violence that we will see seriously when people get very, very scared. Unfortunately, we are none of us beyond that, I think, when we're trying to struggle for the last potato in the field. So that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Kasia, do you want to go next if you see your hand raised there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. First of all, Jane, thank you so much for this. I am adding post-materialism and some other words into my vocabulary. This is really interesting. It's been so interesting to hear all this discussion, and I'm taking a lot from it. It's really nice to hear other people think about the language. Sam, like you mentioned, linguistics, also eco-linguistics, you know, part of this. So something that I do, and Jane actually has been a big part of this as well, with ETHI, which is a sustainability claims verification platform in the UK. We've developed these sustainability standards, and Jane's our primary advisor. So the standards are, they are all built sort of with the mindset that language and vision are really important when it comes to making people take actions. And then especially in sustainability, what we noticed was people talk about climate change and all these things in a really negative way. And people get tired of that, and the climate anxiety and all these things. So for brands and consumers, people to take action, to take those sustainable steps, that positive language is really important. So, for example, within these standards, instead of saying climate change, the whole category is named stable climate. And that's for the reason that let's give people the vision of, well, where do we want to go? Because we don't want to go towards climate change, but if we keep saying climate change, that's where we'll end up. So just trying to change that narrative and trying to provide this language, positive language, has been sort of at the heart of these standards. And yeah, and it's interesting because we've had sort of small brands and big brands now sort of meet these standards and start using this language. And it's really interesting to see that. So I think it's really, really important to encourage this positive vision of the sustainable future.
I think the other thing as well that you just made me think of really is as well, it's to do with that specificness. I don't know what word I'm trying to say there, being specific, because again, I think what you're meeting people where they are. So if you care about veganism, it's there for you to see that this matches you. Or if you care about something having low plastic, it's there. And again, low plastic, not plastic free, or being realistic about it. But and again, it's the idea that we're meeting people where they are, we're getting specific, we're getting small, we're having those conversations about where people are, and then it can also, begin to lead into the other things from there. And I wonder if that's part of it as well, is that idea that it's acknowledging that we all have different priorities within that bigger picture.
Yeah, and also I would add, making it simple. I think we were talking about complexity, and I do think sustainability it's so vast. There's so much to it, and I think it just people are too busy. They have their own lives to live, and it's hard. So sustainability needs to be broken down and made really simple, and kind of like that electricity. You don't even notice. It's easy. That's kind of where, if we can achieve that, and then it's also really positive, that's where potentially, we can make change happen. That's my thoughts anyway. But yeah, these words, like post-materialism, just, having more of these positive words and more of ideas of how to talk about it positively is really useful. So thank you.
Is there anything else anyone else wants to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I would love to. So I was in the US during the race where the Trump election happened. And again, it's not a political topic, and it is. So in my role as a transformation agent, I also wanted to study a lot about psychology and why people are behaving the way they do, and what prevents people from having reflective thought, what prevents people from considering what would be a better choice that they could implement in their life. And I'm afraid that our current economy has kept a part of society so busy that they currently have to run for survival. And it's very, very difficult for them to have some space where they can sit down and really think through what they believe, what they need to research in order to understand better, or where to make different choices. So we have created an economy and a society where a huge proportion of usually the poorer people don't have the luxury to think anymore. And when they're driven by fear, it's very, very easy for big money to run a marketing campaign or a big advertising engine that can influence that opinion of the masses in whichever way they want. And in some countries, it doesn't really matter what party is going to win, because those people that want to influence things can influence any party. So in a way, it could be that we actually really have to form coalitions with people that are able to sue governments, that are able to sue companies, and have more of a success with regards to transformation through something that people can't escape from anymore. That it's actually the rules that our society plays along, which we have to focus on and change, because voting for the right thing might not fix the problem. And we don't have the conditions where people can sit down and think freely. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Nora, do you want to say?
Yes, thank you so much for saying that, Isa, because like for example, I mend my own clothes, and mending like a top takes me like 45 minutes. And like we have created systems where that's a luxury to do. like in my grandfather's time, you would mend things because that was the cheapest thing to do. And today this is like a middle class hobby of being like, oh, look at me as a green, I can mend my own t-shirts. So I completely agree with you. And I don't have anything like intellectual to add, except thank you so much for opening up this point, because it's so true. And also, Ines, you were talking about that as well, fighting for the people who just simply don't have the time or the capacities to even get into that fight or think about that fight. So just thank you for everyone who raises that, because it's so real and so true.
Sam?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There are two groups in our universal societies that have time, and with just the right bit of nudge, I believe the inclination, and those are retirees and students. And I'm really focusing a lot recently on trying to figure out ways of creating linkages, because the retirees have the experience and the students have the energy. And when you combine experience and energy, you can make things happen. I'm curious if anybody on the call has done any work in either of those spaces. I have with middle school students. I did a program with middle school students in the city of New Brunswick, New Jersey. It's a mid-sized city, about 48,000 people, and a classic American city, where an industrial city, Johnson & Johnson in the case of New Brunswick, big plants along the river, and then when the highways came through, they cut the city off from the river. I had a class of teenagers who did not know that there was a river in the city that they grew up in. It was a real eye-opener for me, but when you take the message to the kids, they just can't get enough of it. And I'm just wondering about linkage in programs to engage those who have the time to do something.
I have to add to that. There was a really cool story of 70-year-old Swiss ladies that were creating coalition and sued the government because they said, you're threatening our lives and you're shortening our lifespan by not protecting the environment. So that was like so amazing to read. And these are like tough, fit, older women who are getting into the fight, and they're certainly educated enough to be suing the government. And it's a small country, so it might be easier. But yeah, it's a good example.
It made me laugh because I'm actually involved in a program at the moment where we call it Stewards in Training, and every child, both homeschooled and in school on the island, gets to go on a program. And so the one we're doing at the moment with the grade 6s and 7s is they go out to a lake and they learn all about watersheds. So they have a session on beavers, they have a session on their senses in the marshlands, smelling the skunk cabbage and finding out reeds, blowing reeds, and they have another one looking after the pH, the health of the stream that's been dammed by the beavers and what comes out the other side. And it's fascinating because it is, again, it's mainly the retirees that have the time to volunteer on that program. But it's, again, you're going so much farther there because, again, you're going back to connection. And it's connection between older people and younger people. And obviously they're younger than the students you were saying. But they have the energy and they're galvanized by it. Even if it does mean that they all went around on Monday night with their reeds of grass, and believe me, 60 kids with a reed of grass blowing, it gets very, very loud and very trying, very, very quickly. But they're gaining so much from that. Both sides are gaining so much. And again, it does, they're almost filtering it into the middle because they're taking it home to the parents, and it is going home far more interesting than at school for most of them. And yeah, I just wonder again if stories are going to come out of that.
Well, I also started ASP whilst I was a student with Gwyn, and still to this day, Gwyn, I think you genuinely are the most inspiring person. For me, and for all of Gwyn's experiences throughout his lifetime, and coming into ASP through speaking to Gwyn, like that is something that can't be replaced in any other way than communication, and and these topics, like even tonight, like how all of this conversation has stemmed from you starting this, Jane, and like they're just valuable. And so like everyone, I'm sure, will go away from this tonight like fascinated just by communication and conversation, and just sparking that really. If there's I'm going to pop a few links in the chat box for the ASP website if anyone wants to have a look, as well as Jane's website and a YouTube video for mindfulness. I'll just pop them all in to the chat box now if you want to copy and paste them into somewhere secure so it doesn't just disappear.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my point of view, while you're doing that, Hannah, could I just say a personal huge thank you to everyone for joining this conversation. You've inspired me. I must admit, I'm at that stage at the moment of deep frustration and I'm not very good at the moment in terms of thinking what the future holds for my children. I'm having one of those phases, I must admit. And, you know, to hear you all tonight has inspired me, gives me hope. So thank you all very much. Thank you both to Hannah and to Gwyn for organising this. Hannah, I think you've got another event. Can we plug the next event? Because it looks super cool. I know I'm biased because it's marketing, but can we plug the next event? Because it looks really good. It's not me doing it. We've got you on mute, Hannah. Sorry. Did I just mute you?
No, so I'll just pop it in the chat now.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, is there anything else, Hannah, you want to add to that, or Gwyn?
Just want to thank everyone for coming, really. It wouldn't be an event without everyone showing up and adding to the conversation, really. So yeah, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. This was really great.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Bye. Bye.